right. Hey, before we get started, am I on your screen up in the corner there? Is there a little
Yeah, we
Skype
see.
box?
Yes, we see a little bubble of your head there.
All right.
Yes.
I can't see it, so better to know that I'm there.
Right. Okay. Welcome everyone to today's Energy Symposium, sponsored by the Energy Institute. I'm Kerry King. Next week's talk will be by Mason Inman. He is now a lead analyst for an organization called Near Zero, which focuses on strategy, policies, and making modeling to understand going low carbon. They're based in California. So he's going to give a talk called Scientific Oversight of Climate Policy and Lessons from California. So how do you make sure you keep track of what the goals are and whether the metrics of reaching low carbon goals are indeed doing what they want to be done. So they're an organization that tries to keep track of this. But today we have a very special and faraway guest, Dr. Susan Krumdieck from the University of Canterbury. Susan and I have a couple things in common, that we have mechanical engineering degrees and we no longer focus on making widgets. And we try to focus on big picture items, and so that's what she's going to talk to us today about. She has studied things, or I guess some of her studies have included studying hydrogen storage technologies, and she might give some background on that and how the discussion of today's topic, which is largely around her topic of transition engineering, which she will describe what that is. And of course, what she's calling here the BigDO. It's not the BigDO, like Homer Simpson. I guess it's the BigDO. In a way to approach limiting carbon emissions globally. Another way to think about it, besides global carbon tax or getting all the countries to cooperate and this kind of thing. So, Susan, we will go here, and I think you might see the audience. For those in the audience, if anyone has a question at any time, then raise your hand. And Erin will bring you a microphone so that when you speak into the microphone, she can hear the question and address it as we go from there. Susan, are you ready?
You bet.
Okay, take it away. Thank you.
All right. Well, it's great to be able to talk to you in Texas without having to fly from New Zealand. We do have a direct flight to Houston, but let's just keep it like this, shall we? All right. Yeah, I'm going to talk today about the work I've been doing for a long time, transition engineering, but the most recent big idea we've had, which is the BigDO, and I'll explain how we got to that, and hopefully you'll hear something that you haven't heard before. The setting, what are we talking about? We're talking about that in order to continue our economic growth the way that we think it must continue based on consumption and expansion, we're at a tipping point. We're at a strange place where in order to continue that, we must risk everything. We must risk climate stability for centuries, coastal real estate, biodiversity, civilization as we know it, or we got to do something else. That's our context. We've known for a long time, those of you who are gray hairs like me, that we must fill in the blank, right? We must. In 1990, 40 Nobel Prize winners issued a stark warning to the world. The buildup of various gases introduced by human activity has the potential to produce dramatic climate change. Okay, if scientists' warnings change things, what would be happening by now, 30 years later? There's a lot of science, a lot of modeling, a lot of scenarios that show that we must do something. And the world has gotten together. I mean, we have these moments of clarity where in 2015, the COP21, all the nations of the world agreed, okay, we must try to limit CO2 emissions to stay below the 2-degree warming. You've heard that, right? And all the nations said, okay, we'll do this. And that gets us, okay, not all the way there, but some way. And yet, if we look at what the baseline is, it takes us to somewhere else where we must not go. Now, COP24 says, well, hang on a minute, the whole 2-degree thing is a bit too risky. The target needs to be less than 1.5. How does it look like we're going? How are we doing on this? Because back in 1990, when the scientists of the world warned and we all agreed that okay, climate change is a problem due to this global warming, 350 parts per million was the target that was set to not have changes that we didn't want. And yeah, we've not adhered to the Kyoto Protocol. New Zealand hasn't, America hasn't, and we're not going in the right direction. So is there something we don't understand about the problem? Is that what the issue is? Why are we going in the wrong direction when we know better? Have you ever heard of a monkey trap? The best way to trap a monkey, according to hunters in the bush, is that you put the monkey's favorite food in a small neck jar. Monkeys are problem solvers and they know what they like. So the monkey can smell his favorite food in there, reaches in, he's got a hold of it, and now you got him. Because he'll keep trying to solve the problem of how to get that jar off his hand, of how to get the jar untied from the tree, of how to get his hand out. And he'll keep working on that while the hunter approaches with his club. And then he'll see the hunter and he'll get quite upset and he'll think this isn't fair. And he'll screech and he'll show his teeth and raise his hair. What was the problem, right? What do we not understand about this problem? And I hope my monkey trap helps to illustrate what we don't understand about this problem. But let's think a little bit harder, shall we? The problem is the accumulation of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. The accumulation. The accumulation is the result of the emissions. We talk about the emissions a lot. We talk about our economy a lot, but it's the accumulation. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes giving you a illustration that I worked up with one of the guys from the IPCC, because he said the problem was that engineers didn't understand that it was accumulation that was the problem, not just the emissions. So remembering that 350 was indeed the safe load limit that the IPCC scientists all agreed on, then let's look at that, the 350 parts per million CO2. Back in the 1800s, we started off around 280, 290, and it took quite a while to get 100 gigatons of carbon extracted from deposits where it was and into the air. Then it didn't take too much longer from the time I was born till I went to uni to get the next 100 gigatons into the air, and the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is accumulating. Now, the economy is growing faster, we're doing more exciting things, and sure enough, between the time I went to the university and more recent times, we've blown right past our 350 limit, and we've added another 350 gigatons to the system that we don't want to break. But we've broken it. Now, we don't know exactly how, but we know it's weakened. We know we've gone over the safe load limit. And we know that we are continuing to load that system up, and that this climate change problem is not a future problem anymore, and that we can't get the carbon out in any fashion that makes sense in relation to how fast we're adding the carbon to the system. Now let's talk about the maximum load. This is the maximum load to failure, and it's 800 gigatons of carbon. You can count how much we've already added onto the system. There's 250 left till we hit the maximum load limit, and at current rate of emissions, that doesn't give us very long until we actually fail the system. And that gets us to 550 parts per million. And all the climate scientists say that is not a place we want to go. 2 degrees C warming is not a target. It is a failure limit. What have I done here? I've flipped the perspective of the way we talk about emissions from being a thing that is just part of the problem we have to being the thing which we must not do. It's a failure limit. All right? Fossil carbon production is how this system is getting loaded up with carbon that is pushing towards this failure limit. And a moratorium on that production is a rational emergency response to this system, or to this problem. Have you heard that from anybody before? And the answer is yes, you've heard it from James Hansen, NASA's chief climate scientist. If we go ahead and put the last 250 gigatons of load onto this system and it fails, which it will, then we will lose. And we will lose big if we put the other 1,500 to 2,000 gigatons of economically recoverable reserves that we know about and that the fossil fuel industry is planning on producing. This just seems like we're in some sort of a scenario where it's like one of those disaster movies in Hollywood or something where somebody's got to do something, right? That's why we like to talk about the green solutions, because that is where we are. We need something to happen. We need to do something big. I don't know if you all have read The Hydrogen Economy, the book. It came out in 2002. That's a long time ago when we were at the dawn of the hydrogen economy. We've been at the dawn of the renewable energy economy for a long time. We've had lovely pictures created of how we could have artificial trees, how we could sweep the carbon out of the air. Is it possible we're at a point where there's a dissonance, a cognitive dissonance between the problem we know we have and the way that we're even willing to talk about it? And I showed you the monkey trap for a reason. That's what it should feel like, that you feel like you're in a hopeless situation and you can't figure out what's wrong, and what's wrong is pretty obvious. World primary energy consumption facts show us that we use more oil in terms of million tons of oil equivalent than anything. Oil is our favorite food, so to speak. Gas, next. Coal, we definitely use a lot of coal, and a bit of nuclear and hydro. 2016 data shows that little orange slice is all of our geothermal, wind, solar, and biofuel put together. All right, this, when I listen to podcasts or newscasts or read articles about the energy transition, what I hear are wind and solar, wind and solar. Okay, I'm sorry, but that is not going to stop the emissions accumulation. The growth in each of these sectors in 2016 was 77 million tons of oil equivalent in oil, 57 in gas, did have a drop in coal, bit of growth in hydro, and a small growth in nuclear. But look at the growth in wind, solar, and biofuels. There was growth, that's for sure, and from the size that it was, it's a big growth, but it's not displacing the things that need to be displaced. It's not the way we win this situation that we're in. More renewable energy is an experiment we have already been doing. We've had more and more and more, and the evidence is clear that our ideas of green energy are not changing the emissions trajectory. More renewables, carbon capture, hydrogen, storage are not the way to achieve energy transition. I'm sorry, that's a radical position, but it's based on the evidence that we have in front of us. If that's not how we're going to achieve the energy transition, then what does it look like? It looks like downshift. Downshift in the thing that's accumulating that has to be stopped. The requirement that the world agreed on is an 80% reduction in fossil carbon emissions by 2052. What does that look like? Well, you can get an Excel spreadsheet. You don't need a fancy model. 80%, a student can do that. You take where we're at now in million tons of oil equivalent and you shift it down. I've made it wiggly. In whatever sector you're in. If you are in the paper making sector, you are subject to this 80% fossil fuel reduction requirement. If you're in the aviation sector, you are subject to this requirement. There's no sector that's immune. Okay, there's so many things we could do, but how would that actually happen? Who are the customers for this downshift? How would it be accomplished? Why would people hire transition engineers to downshift their operations to use 80% less fossil fuel? And how would transition engineers make money out of that downshift? The answer I want to put out there is that downshift projects are individual projects in individual organizations, and they happen at the time that it makes sense for them to happen. The top line, the purple line here, is this same trajectory here. You start off with the summation of all of the different sectors and the way they use energy, and then they start to undergo changes, and that brings the change down. Start to think, please, about this 80% reduction, not as the problem. The problem isn't 80% reduction, that's a monkey trap. The problem is individual projects in individual organizations and businesses and operations that change the way they work so that they don't need fossil fuel. All right, what would that look like? For a moment, let's think about energy transition as a mission to save the planet. Fair enough? It kind of feels like that. If we have a mission to save the planet, the sort of thing that we see in Hollywood movies, there's some existential threat and there's some steely-eyed hero who is going to sort this out for us. What is the one thing that we know for sure? We know that failure is not an option. We have to accomplish the mission. And if failure is not an option, then the words that we hear over and over and over, like in the latest book that I participated in writing, that I didn't write these words, and I'm tired of hearing them, if we want to keep global warming under 2 degrees C. If? Seriously? That's not how we would talk about if we want to win World War II, right? If we want to preserve our freedom. Where do you get the word if in a mission to save the planet? So take your mind frame and shift it to where if is not in this discussion anymore. Mission failure is not an option. Why? For the obvious reason, because it's not thinkable. We're not going to go there, all right? Now that we've made that little mind shift, let's recognize that we are losing. There's no other way you can look at the data about the accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere and think to yourself, oh, well, we're having an energy transition to renewables. Because what would that look like in this data? It wouldn't look like that. It wouldn't look like what we're doing. And the temperature rise, we're already locked into a lot more temperature rise than we know. So temperature rise will continue to go up, but that fast and with no relenting back and forwards, okay, now we're losing. So we do have a climate change emergency, and we're committed to doing what it takes to deal with it. No more if. Yes? Okay. But we have a wicked problem. And that wicked problem, let's start with oil. Why oil? I could also talk about coal and gas. And I could talk about deforestation, and I could talk about a lot of things. But oil facilitates all of our other behavior that pushes us into dangerous territory. We're currently sitting around globally about 100 million barrels per day. And what we know about oil is that it works great. There's nothing like it. What we also know is that it's not sustainable. What we know about oil is that we use it and it satisfies our needs. It gets the job done, but it causes harm. We have air pollution, ground level air pollution. We have an awful lot of deaths and property loss in accidents. All right, we have congestion. So something must change. This system must be changed. And yet, how in the world can you change it? You can't. It works. You see where we go round and round? This is a wicked problem. That's the definition of a wicked problem. A wicked problem, you know that you can't change it because if you stopped it today, the whole system would fail. No question. But if you don't stop it, then the climate will fail. So we're stuck. And I agree we're stuck. We got our little fist firmly in the jar and we can't get it out. What could we do? Well, we know that demand reduction would work, right? If people would just change to electric vehicles, if people would just slow down, if people would ride their bicycles, if people would change their behavior, then emissions would reduce. Yes? Everybody's heard that. It's not that hard to calculate some numbers, to look up some literature, to do some analysis, and you get things like, well, okay, 60% per year growth from today of electric vehicles replacing internal combustion vehicles would reduce consumption of oil by 2 million barrels per day in 2023. You remember how many million barrels a day we're using, and you remember that that's growing. So if that's your only end-use behavior change that you think is going to save us, you're wrong. Reducing driving speeds would actually be more effective than introducing electric vehicles, and you wouldn't have to extract all of the materials that go into electric vehicles, which also have a carbon footprint. So here's an interesting thing. That's demand side management, 4 million barrels per day. Yes, eliminating beef. If people would change their diet, that would reduce emissions by 2 million barrels per day. But why would consumers change what they want? That's a good question. People are looking at it. Why would politicians require change that people didn't really want to make? I think we're in trouble. I think this is not going to happen. All right, so what are we going to do? Why does it seem like a hopeless mission? Because we are making too much money doing the thing that's causing the hopelessness. 2016, the year after the COP21 agreement, 1.6 million barrels per day increase in oil production. Why? Saudi Aramco is the biggest oil company in the world, and its revenues in 2016 were 478 billion. Sinopec, Chinese oil company, 455 billion. China Net, Chinese oil company, 429. PetroChina, Chinese oil company, 368. Oh, we get to an American one, 269. Royal Dutch Shell, 252. Kuwait, 252. BP, the British. Total, the French. We have a global, you could say, addiction to oil, but maybe it's more a global profitability of oil. That's why we're stuck. It's a good thing. It's our monkey trap. It's the thing that works. It's the thing we like. It's the thing we know we want. Hugely profitable. Why would we stop it? That's a pretty good question. Don't forget, COP21, we agreed to do something. Okay. And here we are in 2019, pushing over 100 million barrels a day. What are we going to do about this? I'm going to show you a little trick that we use in transition engineering. If your mission seems hopeless, then back up and change your perspective. Okay, we do this in mechanical engineering too, when we're doing product development and you can't get the result that you want. You revisit your problem statement. You back up, you flip your perspective on purpose. So let's do that. Flipping our perspective, here's a little illustration of what that means. Do any of you see what this picture is? Those of you who see a young woman looking into the future, raise your hand. Okay. Does anybody see an old woman gazing into the past? All right, a couple of you see her. A couple of you don't. How can you be looking at something that other people see and you can't see it? The old woman, here's her eye, here's her mouth, here's her chin. She's also wearing a hat. Now do you see her? Now I see her. All right. There's two things. There's two perspectives here in this image. It's a little bit hard to see them both at the same time, but if you consciously say, okay, I'm going to look at the young woman, there's her nose and her chin, looking into the future, I can see her. I'm now going to flip my perspective and see the old woman looking into the past. All right, that is the trick we're going to try to do. We're going to be looking at the same data. We're going to be looking at things the same as somebody else, but we're going to know that we're going to see things differently. And here's that difference. If oil supply declined fast enough, then the emissions would decline fast enough. There's the word we're going to work on. If oil supply declined fast enough to reach 80% reduction by 2052, then the emissions would decline fast enough. Calculating what fast enough is not difficult. Understanding that the emissions that require that would decline, that's not difficult. The one thing that is difficult is this one. So now that we've flipped our perspective, we're gonna focus on that with laser vision. Because here is our positive story, the alternative in that bad story we had before. Can't do anything about that. We're already here. We're already at now 410 parts per million. So we turn the tide. We have our back against the wall. We are outnumbered. We are outgunned. We're in a bad position. And yet we turn the tide and we win the battle. This is a thing that in military history is the thing people always want to know. How did William Wallace, with 1,000 or 1,200 people with no horses, defeat 10,000 British on horses? How did that happen? He thought of something clever and executed it perfectly. This happens, that people in a desperate situation sometimes win. That's what we're looking for. We turn the tide. What does it look like? Yes, it looks like we reform our agricultural system so that more carbon is absorbed into the plants and the soils than are released. That's one. Yes, we replant and regrow and reforest an awful lot of this planet. Yes, and the amount of fossil fuel we use between now and 2040 declines amazingly. And then it's very small because we don't need it anymore to run our economy, right? So a lot of this oil that we did use, a lot of this carbon that we expended was to achieve this economy. Fair enough? That's a matter of design. There's our remaining 100 gigatons and we got 50 to spare. Okay, who are the mysterious folks who are going to achieve that? This is a transition engineering class from last year at Canterbury University, and they're pretty sure they could take that on. And that's us on our field trip in the mountains. And here's how you do it. You have one objective, only one. Don't think about anything else. This is how you turn the tide on a hopeless battle. Here's the one objective. Whatever you were doing, you're going to stop. We agreed on that, right? That the one way to keep the emissions from being in the air is to leave the carbon where it was. That's not mysterious. Here's what it looks like with simple mathematics. We're calling it a production retreat. Here's our historical production data for oil. And here is that easily calculable production retreat to a much lower level of oil production. And here is the carbon produced by this oil production accumulating in the atmosphere. We know that that's what we have to have happen with the accumulation of carbon in the atmosphere. That's how we would get it. I know, we're looking at the impossible. But let's keep going, shall we? That's a 10% retreat per year. 10% per year retreat. That is faster than the growth that was experienced in the past. So be it. That's what we're talking about. All right. How do we get to where we even understand how that could happen? We used, my group, something called the matrix game. The matrix game is a military strategy approach where you have one objective. You must achieve it. There is no option for failure. You then identify the situation you're in, the real data, the real facts. You put those on the table. Now, those can't change. Facts. But you now identify who the players are, who have options, and what those principal actions that those people could take could be. You are assuming that each actor acts, they have a range of actions according to their own principles and their own rules. Now, what you do in the matrix game is that you have a negotiation with the principles and conditions and arguments for achieving the objective. So I've got 4 actors, I have the one objective, and we do negotiation rounds with each of the actors according to their arguments. What conditions would you, under what conditions would you accept this objective? We're going to do this objective. How do we achieve it? All right, we had no idea if this would work, but it seems to work for developing treaties and negotiating things, so we took a guess. Who are the 4 main actors in this production retreat? Well, the first and most obvious one is the oil and gas companies. That's not mysterious. They would have to do it. Then there's the economy of the world, and we represented that by the OECD. The OECD is an international organization whose job is to keep the economy rolling, yes? Then we've got the United Nations, and the United Nations is focused on the well-being of the world's people and the climate change problem. So they're definitely one of the big actors. And then we've got the International Energy Agency, who was formed after the OPEC oil embargo in the 70s to make sure that the energy supply for the world was managed in a way that we didn't have any more oil shocks and we didn't have economic destruction due to that. So these do seem like the good set of players. Why do we not have consumers in there? Because consumers will use whatever works. It's somebody's job to re-engineer the things that use oil so that they work with less oil. And that we're pretty sure can just be done. If it was your job, you would do it. What we're trying to do is turn it around so that this objective creates all those jobs. All right, let's start. Why would the oil companies retreat? Why would they run off the battlefield, so to speak? Why would they go into retreat? It doesn't look like it's in their interest to do it, but according to the principles of a large company, if they made more money in the production retreat than continuing with their current plan, the way they're doing business, then they would do it. How could it be possible that oil companies could possibly make more money producing 10% less oil next year? Can you imagine how that would work? And there's one simple answer, and that's that if the oil was more expensive, they would make about the same money if they produced 10% less oil. There's also, well, they're doing a lot of things that don't have a great return right now, like seismic exploration in 4-kilometer deep water, like trying to get up into the Arctic Circle, floating a giant oil rig up around the coast of Alaska and it crashes on a sandbar. They're doing a lot of things that are huge expenditures that are objectively not creating great returns. If they didn't have to do that anymore because they know that their future business model is actually managing the really good resources they have already got for much longer term, much higher profitability, then isn't it conceivable that this could become the business plan? All right, there's a lot of work to do yet to see how it could. And part of that work is that there would have to be some kind of agreement that these individual companies would have to work in some way that was organized so that one of them can't run off and violate the retreat, that they can't undermine each other, that they don't allow black marketing in. Yeah, but all of that is kind of negotiable. It's where we start work now. So to a certain extent, it should be within the realm of possibilities that at least the top major oil companies could work out how production retreat would actually be their business plan for the future. All right, managing their retreat. The International Agency says hey, international agency says, hang on a minute, we were put in place to make sure that there weren't ever any oil shortages again. So how do we deal with that? Well, the IEA right now, their statement says that they promote international collective action on climate change. They actually say that. Right now, the IEA spends a lot of time modeling demand, and they say that in their latest 2018 World Outlook, that the demand for electricity is set to increase 60 to 90%. Demand for gas is going to increase. Demand for oil is going to increase to 106 million barrels per day, even with all the new policies around COP21 and COP24. Demand for coal is going to continue to increase to 2040. So the IEA, when they do their modeling looking at demand, they agree with us that this is not the way to achieve climate stability. And then after they do all their demand modeling in the report, the Energy Outlook report, they state the projected emissions trend represents a major collective failure to tackle the environmental consequences of energy use. Okay, thank you for stating the obvious, but IEA, what do you think, IEA? Could you sit down with the oil producers and figure out how you would manage this retreat on a global scale between the different actors? What would it take to manage the retreat? And the answer to that is forewarning. As long as the management can be worked out at least 12 months ahead of the action, then all of the participants, the demands, the users, the businesses could respond to that by changing their demand. Right now, we've got unconstrained demand. It's only constrained by price, and the price elasticity is not good enough to actually have price change demand much. But constraint changes design. And that is what transition engineering is here to do for you. So apply the constraint, and we've got a lot of transition engineering jobs. OECD, from the position of economics, would 10% less oil over the course of a year crash the global economy? Answer is yes, if in that same year the price of oil doubled. Carrie can tell you all about that. But what if in that international agreement of those oil companies, they agreed on what the higher price needed to be for them to participate in the retreat, for it to be their new business plan, and that price was agreed that it would be set. The crazy fluctuation of price is probably more destructive than a set price. And so the oil majors and the OECD need to get together and decide how the price is going to be fixed, how it's going to be decided what the level is that it's going to be fixed at, and how they're going to let the rest of the world know what the oil price is going to be so they can start to redesign according to that. Think about it. If you knew what the price of oil was going to be, you could work that into your plan, into your demand management plan, into your redesign of your supply chain, into what you're going to do about your vehicles, all right? So again, the OECD says, well, if people knew ahead of time, then the response to that constraint could be achieved. The price needs to be controlled at a stable level. And what we know, according to the OECD's own reports, are that the failure to limit warming is much more expensive than an increase in fuel price. The other thing is that if you dig far enough into their reports, you can find that they keep saying that the energy transition, that change, as opposed to just trying to chug along with the way we are doing things now, that stimulating a change could actually stimulate whole new types of economic growth that don't necessarily have to be in more consumption of fossil fuel. And if you look at where we actually use fossil fuel, you see that we've got a long way to go if we had redesign and we had options that we wouldn't have to use all this fuel anyway. All right, so there again, we do, having looked at the projects of downshift in energy use, we know those projects are there waiting for the constraint to stimulate them. All right, the United Nations. Why would they think it's a good idea for the oil companies of the world to get together, to collude to set the price, and to agree to restrict the amount of production that they put into the market? Why would the United Nations think that's a good idea? Well, there's one really good reason. We keep talking about to 2040 to 2050, and we think in our little minds that that's a long term. But in the minds of my students that I teach, that is not a long term. That's their mid-career. And they're thinking to themselves, you know, with the climate change that's already locked in, we're going to need fuel just to deal with it. And leaving some for later is a lesson that we learn when we're kids, hopefully. And the United Nations says that climate action is more urgent than ever. Somebody has to do something. And we really do need fuel for things that are important to do. All right, so the United Nations actually says, hang on, we could facilitate that organization of the major oil companies. And we would actually like to be in charge of that agreement to make sure that it is fair and that it's equitable and just, and really we want to oversee how it's done, because the oil industry is a global economic interest. We want to oversee that, and we want to do it with OECD and the IEA. All right, so here's what that production retreat looks like. In 2019, the UN organizes a coalition of oil producers, and they hold their first meeting in Paris, because that'd be a little symbolic. This COOP1 sets up the ground rules for cooperation amongst the oil majors. The COOP1 establishes a production cap and trade with declining production quota. It sets up the means to police that and the agreement to achieve it. The COOP1 announces that there will be a 10% reduction retreat in both 2019 and 2020. I made these slides last year, so I guess we got to go 2020 and 2021 because I said we needed a 12-month warning. So the warning is given. Be prepared because next year there's going to be 10% less oil, and here's what the price is going to be. All right. Then in the COOP3, they announce a further 10% reduction for future years. Very quickly, the people of the world, the economies of the world, come to understand that the future is not going to be like the past. Stop talking about hydrogen, stop talking about carbon capture, and start working on change. That change is doable. It's not magic. If the oil production retreat were announced and implemented, then the market for downshift projects would grow exponentially. And the proposition that I'm putting forward is that transition engineering is the next big thing that needs doing. And what we know about the past, we know about the lessons of history, is that every time something needs doing, the engineering competencies that already exist that can be put to work on that new field come together and start to form up their language, their methodologies, their textbook for that field. And that field starts to emerge, it starts to gain market share, it starts to have consultancies, and they start to do that work in the way that we understand engineering to be done. You start to have departments of that engineering. You start to have students graduating with that competency. Now, the way that I see transition engineering working is that it's a cross-disciplinary field. You have transition engineers in transport, in food production, in manufacturing, in buildings, in tourism. All right, so transition engineering is a cross-disciplinary approach. And the job of the transition engineers is to change existing systems to downshift the fossil fuel use. Existing systems, not a hoped for future type of dawn of something that we don't know what it is and we want a demonstration project and maybe in 30 years. Nope, the existing system you already have now changes. And we change our operations to downshift water and materials consumption. Why? Because there's embedded energy use in everything else we do. And we work on new operations, new buildings. We do have to build a lot of new things. new ways of sensing, of controlling, of working markets, which don't use fossil fuel and use minimal materials. So these areas, what is interesting is that if you start looking at these projects, you see them and you can start doing them right away. All right, the BigDO. Here's what it looks like. Imagine a future where you look back and you go, oh, that was interesting. In 2019, the top oil companies got together and set out a really big project, and within 6 months, they had engineered their planned retreat of production and how they were going to do that. And then it was pretty obvious that one of the first steps was to retire the oldest refineries because they were losing money anyway. And the airline companies looked at that 10% retreat and went, okay, well, we reduce our flights by 10% a year then, but there's a big how in how you would do that and keep the system running. Cities transition engineer for redevelopment of low car use. Again, people know what this looks like. They just don't know when the project should start. Freight logistics, supply chains, transition engineered. Containers, disposables, transition engineered out of existence. And all of this work could be called adaptation to a constraint. Engineering is good at this. If we define the problem as how to adapt to a constraint, we are very good at achieving it. We have not yet put our focus on that as our problem as the projects we're working on, have we? We've been off in the tulips talking about more and more and more renewables. Fine, there's enough people working on more renewables. Now we need an army, an absolute agreement, focus on adaptation of our existing systems to meet this one objective. Okay, are we ready to go there? It looks like a strange place that we don't know what's going on there, where we're going. Start and we'll see where it goes, because 100 years from now, our farming systems are regenerative, our wild areas are wild and growing, and we're using less than 10 million barrels per day to run a large and vibrant economy that meets the needs of people. There's negative emissions happening because of the way that we use the land. And consumption is lower, obviously, by tenfold, but the quality is higher because you have a huge opportunity, if you're going to change the way we do things now, to take a hard look at the way those things actually have a lot of negative impacts and engineer those out. Engineer for increased quality at the same time you're engineering for reduced consumption. Coordination and organization and realized value are the key metrics for this new way of engineering, which depends on resourcefulness much more than it depends on resources. And I'm just going to hit you with some inspiring images of what that world looks like 100 years from now. It doesn't necessarily look that different from our world, except it is quite clean and a bit green. That 10 million barrels per day, what's it being spent on? Well, it's being spent on the things we need in that environment. All right, I get it. It's impossible. But we're just going to do it. Like I said, no if. It's what we're going to do. How do we do it? Well, transition engineers. What if we got together? Oops, I said what if. We take a proposal for an international and multidisciplinary energy transition collaboratory institute group to the 12 biggest oil companies. And we get them to fund the effort for us to work with them to help have a neutral playing field, a no man's land where everybody can get together and work on this crazy idea of a coalition of producers under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, develop the COP plan, advertise and carry out the planned production retreat, and then transition engineers will be quite busy helping all companies, organizations, cities, countries carry out energy shift projects and develop their transition strategies and carry those out. And yeah, 100 years from now, or maybe even just 10 years from now, the world is working in a way that we maybe didn't see today, but that is absolutely doable. It just has to be done. And that energy transition, the downshift of fossil fuel use in everything while uplifting social and environmental benefits, does actually cause a lot of growth. But it's the growth in everything that works without the massive fossil fuel millstone around its neck, monkey trap on its arm. All right. Yeah, we love the fossil fuel and we have to have them, but we don't have to waste them and we don't have to put them in the air now. And we will have bigger problems in the future, like parking. People have to be circling the parking lot trying to find a place. We'll always have problems. We'll always have challenges. But dealing with a catastrophic climate failure won't be one of them. All right, so that's my proposal, actually, of the BigDO, is a global university approach of a neutral playing field for working out this coalition of oil producers agreement to do the big retreat, the International Energy Transition Collaboratory. I don't know, just let it sink in. Ask me a question. It's worth a go.
Okay, thank you.
In case you're wondering.
Thank you very much, and we'll see what their questions are. Let's give her a round of applause. Okay, again, raise your hand if you have a question, because we definitely have to bring the microphone to you.
Well, thank you so much. It's not so much a question as just an observation. In some ways, Texas is a possible microcosm for a lot of what you're proposing, at least in the energy sector, in the electricity portion of the energy sector. I think we're well on our way to, at least by 2025 or 2026, seeing a reduction in carbon emissions through just the business as usual approach of ERCOT's creating a generation mix that's going to be, by energy, about 50% zero carbon, wind and solar. And the remaining 50% is the challenge between 2025 and 2030 or thereabouts. As far as the transportation sector, we're also, I think, pretty far along with movement toward electrification of transportation. That'll take 10 years for sure.
Right.
Right.
New Zealand, we have last year, we produced 81% of all of our electricity from renewables. And we're nowhere near meeting our carbon emission targets. We drive as much or more than you do in the US, and our cars are getting bigger. We import secondhand vehicles from Japan. And there is a dissonance between the story we want to tell ourselves that we are on our way and it's all going to be okay, and the facts of what our emissions actually are compared to what we have to do. So I would caution a little bit. I know we're used to saying that we're on our way and it's all good. But every time I dig into, okay, are we going to meet that 80% reduction? And now it's by 2040, not 2052 when I wrote these slides. Not even close. So something extraordinary really does have to happen. And business as usual takes us where we actually know it's going to take us. There may be some things happening, but a very clear eye and skepticism of when stories are about how we don't have to really worry because it's going to be okay. I go with skepticism first now after 30 some years of pursuing clean energy.
Okay, here's another question.
Thank you for the presentation. So I had a question about the petrochemical industry as a whole, not just oil and gas. So the demand for, say, polymers or plastics, that's also going up. Would you also suggest that, well, the companies put that on the companies that, okay, they need to reduce their production, or have a policy in place for the consumer to like put a tax or something like that, or encourage lower use of those kind of products?
Let me follow up on that, Susan. So yeah, oil or hydrocarbons used because we burn them versus hydrocarbons that we don't burn. How do we think about
Right.
that? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a really good question because to a certain extent, well, okay, do you agree that our backs are against the wall? That we're really at a point of transition where in the 70s we might have said encouraging consumers to do fill in the blank, incentivizing fill in the blank, having a tax on something fill in the blank, that made sense 30 or 40 years ago. At this point, we have enough information, we have enough data to see how effective those things are, and that is not how we're going to win. So the 10% per year production retreat of oil would also signal to the plastics manufacturers that, you know, that thing that people have been complaining about for a while, like whales dying from eating plastic that's floating in the ocean, you know, these things that we've been worried about for a while. It's now time to work out how you're going to not do that anymore. What's your next plan for packaging? You know, what do you do next? So I really like the flipped perspective, not encouraging consumers to do anything. It will be obvious to them what to do when the system changes and their options are now amongst other things, right? I get what you're asking, but that's from a previous time when we had some more time. And now it's about adaptation to the changed circumstances that we find ourselves in.
Here's another question.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation and an excellent topic. As I go through what you've said, my thoughts go to three different things, and I wonder if you could tell us if you've explored these in any further way. One is the commons, and how do these actors behave in a way that doesn't overgraze the commons and keep us going to the same problem. It's not just about oil, but it's, as Drawdown would say, it's food emissions, CFCs from refrigerators. All of these things are going towards the saturation of our climate and the carbon equivalents in the atmosphere. It's not just oil and energy. The second part I was wondering about is when I think about the U.S. road system and how we drive every day getting from homes to work, the roads that we have to travel, it's a huge embedded energy in our systems and our infrastructure. And so what you're really saying is, as Americans, to get down to that 10 million barrels per day global use, we have to rebuild our whole country in 10 years. That's a massive amount of embedded energy needed in equipment and redesign of our systems to be able to live on such a small amount of energy, because we weren't designed for that. And so have you looked at what is that roadmap that transitions us in terms of, you know, do we all have to give up 80% of our driving in 1 year in order to release enough energy for the bulldozers to create the new roads and the, you know, what surfaces are those roads? Have you done any of that bottoms up type gross analysis that feeds into your plan? And that, I guess that leads me to the last statement is, if I think about it from that way and I start trying to build up from the bottoms up, this looks like still a very disruptive thing to certain segments of the economy to create enough capacity for the other segments to make the big adjustments they need in time. Is it possible to handle disruptions in some segments and compensate them enough in addition to the oil system. Where does all the money come from? Because just doing oil, I don't think is going to hit the target. There's going to be other sectors that have to face big disruption as well.
All right. So your first question or your first point was it's not just oil. Imagine if I had tried to cover all the other things that you need to transition. I chose oil because on a certain level, it might actually be the easiest if you think of this flip perspective of addressing directly what the problem is, downshifting it. Yeah? Because the oil pervades all of the other things that we do. So you're right, it is not just oil, but this same way of thinking applies to any other sector. So the oil one, let that, give you the shivers, but it's the obvious one to start with. You asked, have I done any analysis on this transition that we're talking about? And the truth is, yes, since 2000 and some, when I first met an academic in transport engineering, and I was working on energy engineering, and we started having conversations around oil. And I started working on one of the first really big breakthroughs in transition engineering methodology, which is to take your perspective and move it 100 years either side of where you are now. So take a trip back in time 100 years and visit that place where you are now, but 100 years ago, and understand that people make things work, no matter where they are, what they're doing. That's our superpower as a species, is we just make things work. All right, so now you move forward 100 years, and I don't think that anybody could rationally say we'll be using 100 million barrels per day in 100 years from now. Yeah? So you force yourself to face the thing that you are having a hard time picturing. And what you see is that 100 years from now, yep, those people their cities are fine, they're working just fine, and they're not using fossil fuels to move around, they're using it for really important things. And that a lot of the stuff that we've built now, 100 years from now, its design life is well and truly over. If you didn't maintain your freeways in the way you do, 100 years is a pretty long stretch. It's not a long stretch for something like our Capitol building or the Statue of Liberty, the things that we take care of and we keep in working order, because we're not actually trampling all over them all the time. But the solar panel you put on your house today, it's not there 100 years from now. It's rubbish in a landfill somewhere. The wind turbine you put up today, it's not there. The car you buy today is not there 100 years from now. So in the next 100 years, your malls are going to have to be rebuilt, your city center, your suburbs, and that's where what we design and build now is what transitions us to that. So what I found out when I started working on that is that the thing we don't know is what's the adaptive capacity of the systems we've already got. How much can what we've already invested in, what we've already built, how long can it last, and how much can it adapt to lower energy use? I was amazed that we do not know that, and that there's no techniques to measure it. And so I have contributed to the literature, several of those, ways to measure adaptive capacity. How much adaptive capacity is there in current consumer behavior, in the operation of systems, in the way that the market works in that system, and we've actually made some pretty interesting innovations around that. Now, you said there's a big disruption going forward from here. I wonder what the disruption in 1849 looked like in California. There was a huge disruption of what was there, and it was called the gold rush. I wonder what the disruption in the 1930s and 40s looked like in our cities, where the trams that were used in those cities were ripped up and cars were put in. Essentially what I'm saying is that when we talk about change, there may be something which is no longer having a future. North Atlantic cod, yeah? There's something which we've screwed it up, we made a mistake, that doesn't have a future. And what that creates once we see it is a rush into what we are going to use next. So I think if we study that a little bit, we'll see that what we might perceive as a disruption or something destructive is actually just, it's a transition. That's what happens. And being in on that transition and making sure it's designed to work in the forward operating environment is a job that engineers are specifically well suited to do. Hope that answers those questions.
Is this working? Thank you for your talk. I have a question in relation to, I really appreciate a lot of your points on countries coming together, specifically oil companies, and setting the price. As you mentioned, that's a very, it's a very difficult thing to achieve. However, my question is, how do you think geopolitics relate into this? It's one thing to say that all countries can come together, but obviously the world is not a peaceful place. The U.S., for example, according to the Energy Information Agency, not to be confused with the International Energy Administration, has an outlook that the U.S. will be net energy exporters by 2020. How do you relate geopolitics with all of this? Because some of your assumptions seem to be in a very peaceful world.
All right. Okay, here's another blasphemy. The politics of the world always follows behind the activities of the powerful in the world, right? If, just picture it this way, if this miracle happened and the 30 biggest oil companies, which do represent an awful lot of the world, got together and said, you know what, this new business plan actually looks pretty good to us, because it's not in our interest to have wars over these things. It's not in our interest to have people blowing things up, you know, and we're just going to do this. Pretty quickly, you would have the governments of the world saying, hey, we have this great idea. You know, you see that link, don't you? That there's a tail wagging a dog when it comes to oil, that and the things that oil feeds into, like automobiles and that really, if the oil companies decided this is what they wanted to do, then who would tell them that's not what they want to do?
Good question. Really, a global cartel of oil as opposed to the other smaller cartels that don't quite cooperate yet. So here we go, another question.
Thank you for the presentation. So you mentioned revolutions in agriculture, and I was just wondering if that means like growing different types of crops, or like shifts in diets, or if it means becoming like less dependent on oil for processes like food harvesting. And also I was wondering what a transition engineering looks like in the food supply chain, because obviously people are going to demand food at like greater rates. So I was wondering if it means that like shifts in consumer diets will be necessary, like eating more in-season food or local food.
All right, the food and agriculture question. Thank you for asking that. I have a bunch of students this semester working on that area. Half of New Zealand's greenhouse gas emissions are from our agriculture. We're particular that way. We grow a lot of food for other people, and we grow a lot that comes out of cows. So we know, and this is interesting, that if you actually talk to scientists in different fields, scientists, practitioners, it is known how a farm, how an agricultural system that is regenerative would work. That isn't the mysterious part. The mysterious part is how would you change an industrialized extractive agricultural system to a regenerative one? It's the transition engineering that's actually the question. Again, the consumers have learned how to use a supermarket system. If you go back in time 100 years, you see that systems have been quite different. Consumers, which here's another thing, I predict that in 100 years we will not refer to our fellow human beings as consumers. That would be an insult. We'll refer to them as free humans, citizens, producers, but not consumers. That would be insulting. So we know that people learn very quickly what works. And so the job then is transition engineering of our current food production systems to something else. And that something else, if you look at it with a systems view, the consolidation supermarket system actually does a pretty good job of being pretty lean on energy use, but at the expense of a lot of other things. So we actually have looked at an information technology system that allows the food producers, the farmers, to sort of get together and form a co-op where they agree on a retreat from the industrial farming mechanism that allows them to get credit for being in that retreat. You know, right now you can get credit and a higher price for your goods if you can get to certified organic. But that's really hard and it takes a long time, and it's not an industry-wide trend. So the thing we need to do is get that to be an industry-wide trend, and that's more of an information system. Now in our supermarket end, if you had in the marketplace that transition as an option, the same way that you now do have some organic produce as an option, think about that. That didn't used to be there. There wasn't an organic option in supermarkets, and now it's in an awful lot of them. So the supermarket system has found that the marketplace accepts these kind of changes and is actually willing to monetize it. And so I think it's not that big of a thing. It's another thing that seems hopeless when you look at it, that how could that change? But if you're willing to just flip your perspective around to say, okay, it's going to change, how would I actually design that change? And what kind of new information system do we need maybe? Or what kind of the supermarket, how does it transition to this other thing? And yes, we need more local production, but that has to also be consolidated, because 300 farmers driving 300 trucks of things to a marketplace where they're not sure what that marketplace wants is not an energy efficient system. Okay, there needs to be this energy efficiency baked into the whole thing, and it does look different but doable. So again, a little bit hard to describe the sort of things we're working on, but if you start asking that question like you did and just say, okay, how would I design it then, and learn a lot about a particular agricultural system in a particular place, you can start to see what you would do and why it would be of benefit to who, and therefore how to monetize it.
Good afternoon. Thank you for a most enlightening talk on oil. You concentrated on petroleum, and the 3 of the 5 largest oil companies are Chinese. Now, China is the #1 importer of oil. Probably India is second or third. Both China and India have embarked on ambitious uranium reactor programs, and 100 miles north of the American border in the Athabasca Basin of Alberta and Saskatchewan is enough uranium to take care of 50% of the world. Have any comments on going oil, or why can't we go uranium?
Right. Yeah, the Chinese, it's funny because they've got 3 of the biggest oil companies, but they're not actually sitting on the oil. They're doing a good job of going around the rest of the world and getting a hold of oil and getting it into their country. I would like to say that one of those big oil companies from China has commissioned a transition engineering project. And I'm quite impressed with their 150-year view, with their pragmatism, and with their complete lack of shock at the idea of drastically reducing production now to have a stable way of using things later. That doesn't faze them one bit. So it might not be as hard as it seems like to actually conceive of this oil production retreat. Now, what about uranium? That is a whole nother kettle of fish. And before we embark on more uranium, I would like to see us understand how we can fit into the constraints of electricity supply. The era where we could think about that we need more, we could get more, we have more, we get more, we need more, we have more, we get more, we need more, that cycle of growth of more, that era is over. And that in the decline of need and growth of demand, that in that downshift era, the answers and the questions are really different than they were on the uphill side. And we haven't yet even begun to deal with the nuclear that we've already built as far as its 100-year perspective. So I really would like to see us work on our elegance of consumption, our elegance of demand, our elegance of design, way before we work on more supply from something that we have not yet even dealt with in a holistic way.
All right, we'll have one more question, and we're getting close to getting kicked out here.
Yeah.
Some countries such as Norway and Kuwait will obviously do quite well, but do you have a mechanism for countries like, say, Angola that are poor and rely very heavily on oil, and perhaps even Guyana, which hasn't even started producing yet, but is told it has a bright oil future?
All right. I have 2 PhD students right now from Ecuador. Ecuador is in the post-peak decline era of its oil boom prosperity, and it's going, okay, what happened to that? Why are we in so much debt? Why? So those PhD students are in freight supply chain transition research. And I have another PhD student from Guyana. And we were in Guyana last year conducting research, and we're planning on being there again this October. And she is an energy manager for the National Guyana electricity system. And yeah, that oil thing looms large. How does a little country like Guyana stand up to the oil companies of the world and say, wait a minute, we want to do this our way, right? It is extremely hard. And to a certain extent, every Guyanese that I've met, including in their energy ministry, knows that they'd be better off if they could just build their own oil system, their own oil extraction, and use the oil for themselves, than to just clip the ticket and go into debt trying to build the infrastructure for the oil extraction. They know they would be better off, and they so far were very receptive to the idea of being able to think differently and just explore that and see where that takes them. I don't know. Show me a country that it's really worked out for when the rest of the world finds out you've got oil.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Susan, thank you from the other side of the planet.
Well,
Low
thanks for
carbon travel over here for presentation. So let's give her a round of applause. Thank you again.